Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to unpack a pretty dark, highly complex chapter of history. We're looking through the lens of archival journalism to examine the totally unchecked escalation of anti-Jewish violence in 1926 Romania. I'm really passionate about making these intricate historical moments accessible, so we're going to dive into the exact reports from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and the Detroit Jewish Chronicle from that specific year to see how this all unfolded. It's a really eye-opening look at how state passivity essentially nurtured mob violence. All right, let's just confront the stark reality right out of the gate. According to a verified report from August 17, 1926, several Jewish passengers were thrown out of the windows while the train was in motion. Now, that is not an exaggeration. That is a direct historical dispatch. We're skipping any sort of political agenda here to just thrust you right into the terrifying conditions aboard Romanian railways that year. Just imagine being a passenger on a public train, completely vulnerable, while the state literally looks the other way. Section 1. Terror on the tracks. What's truly striking about these historical dispatches is just the sheer brazenness of these attacks. Throughout 1926, on specific lines like the Targalakna Odgud Banics and the Galatz Trnavits, armed bands of students and nationalist agitators, who are known as Kusists, routinely stormed the trains, and they specifically targeted Jewish passengers. But you know what the most shocking part is? The archival reports explicitly note that the railway personnel and the police remained completely passive. They literally just stood by and watched it happen. And we really have to remember, these weren't just statistics, right? These were real people. The archival dispatches actually name specific victims. Men like Isaac Stern, John Q. Silberstein, Josef Hershkovitz, Samuel Heller, and Simon Scharf. These men were brutally beaten and, in some horrifying cases, hurled right out of moving trains. They suffered terrible injuries simply for trying to travel, with absolutely zero protection from the state apparatus. Archival reports show us exactly how violence snowballs when it's just left unchecked. We see these initial attacks starting in April, which are then followed by even more severe attacks in August. Because there were literally no consequences for the attackers, public safety just rapidly deteriorated. The authorities did absolutely nothing to intervene, which ultimately paved the way for an even greater, incredibly targeted tragedy in November. Section 2. The murder of David Falik. So to really understand the riots and the murder that followed, we have to look at the catalyst. Nationalist students were pushing for what's called a numerus nullis, which is a total ban on Jewish students in universities. But the government was actually already covertly applying a numerus clausus, basically an educational quota. In fact, reports note that authorities deliberately failed over 75% of Jewish students in their baccalaureate exams. Obviously, this blatant systemic discrimination sparked some pretty desperate protests from the students and their families. And this systemic discrimination didn't stop at the schools. It quickly spilled right over into the judicial system. On November 10, 1926, 12 Jewish students were put on trial in Czernowitz. And their crime? Protesting those rigged exams. It is a stunning display of double standards. Jewish students demanding their basic educational rights were swiftly arrested, prosecuted, and punished by the state, while the violent hooligans who were literally throwing people off trains were just walking free. Then, the unthinkable happens right inside the Hall of Justice. A nationalist university student named Tutu, who was saturated with anti-Semitic propaganda, traveled from Jassy to Czernowitz with the express purpose of committing murder. He shot one of the young Jewish defendants, David Falik, right there in the courtroom. Falik's tragic dying words, "Hide me, Morescu is pursuing me, tell him that I am not here," give us this chilling sense of the absolute terror haunting these students. Morescu was a notoriously violent agitator, and his shadow loomed incredibly large over this assassination. As you might expect, the reaction from the public was profound. In a massive, silent protest demonstration, an estimated 50,000 people, Jews and Christians alike, marched behind young David Falik's coffin. The entire bustling business city of Czernowitz completely shuttered its doors. Black flags hung from buildings everywhere. It was this monumental display of grief and a silent, powerful condemnation of the state's total failure to protect its citizens. Section 3. Anatomy of a pogrom. Following a congress of Romanian university students, a gathering the government actually allowed to happen despite knowing it spread poisonous propaganda, pogroms exploded in Chișinău and Călărași. The documented atrocities were severe, to say the least. Men, women, and children were beaten in the streets, stores were completely looted, homes were damaged, window panes smashed in, and synagogues were violently desecrated. And the authorities, well, they only stepped in after the destructive work was already done. What's perhaps most alarming in these records is how the perpetrators were treated afterward. The systemic failure is so clearly documented in how these criminals were basically celebrated. David Falik's killer was actually proclaimed a national hero and petted by the nationalist press. And remember Moraz Gescu, the agitator Falik seared in his dying breath? Archival sources note he had previously confessed to the murder of 33 Jews on the Dniester border, yet he was acquitted, elevated to the status of a patriot, and even elected to parliament. Unbelievable. According to the historical records, this complicity went all the way up to the top echelons of the government. Instead of condemning the hooligans, Interior Minister Goga actually blamed the victims. He publicly stated that the Jews had converted into perpetrators of violence. This was clearly a calculated political move to completely invert the reality of the situation, and it provided top-down cover for the mobs that were committing these atrocities. Section 4. The International Outcry. The archival reports show a truly stark contrast between the official narrative and the objective truth. On one side, you have the Romanian minister to Washington, George Cristiano, issuing flat diplomatic denials, claiming there was no trouble anywhere, everything being completely quiet. But on the other side, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the American Jewish Congress, and the Committee of Jewish Delegations in Paris had verified the horrific reality of the pogroms, the train attacks, and the cold-blooded murder of David Falik. The international community wasn't buying the denial for a second. The United Romanian Jews of America issued a fierce open letter condemning the Romanian government, holding it directly responsible for the crimes. What's incredibly striking about these reports is the historical parallel drawn by American journalists at the time. They pointed out the stark difference between America, which was actively battling the Ku Klux Klan through the press and the courts, versus Romania, which was actively ignoring and frankly quietly encouraging its own violent mobs. But here is where the tide actually begins to turn, and it's ultimately driven by economic consequences. Practical intervention didn't happen out of some moral duty. It happened when the wallets were threatened. The Chamber of Commerce warned that traders were afraid to travel, which was hurting domestic business. The Jassy Railroad directors finally pledged to remove instigators purely because revenues were dropping. And most importantly, all this instability jeopardized much-needed international loans from the United States. In the end, it was money that forced the government's hand. So, we leave you with this lingering question to think about. When a state remains completely passive to mob violence, at what point does it become the architect of its own moral and economic collapse? The historical echoes of 1926 Romania are a really powerful reminder of the documented responsibility of those in power to protect all citizens, not just a select few. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really encourage you to keep questioning and keep learning from the primary sources of our past.